So let's have a look at the FX Draw screen. It's a very complicated screen with lots of buttons simply because FX Draw does so much. The top two lines of buttons on the top two toolbars we'll talk about in later lessons. For the moment, we're going to concentrate on the drawing tools, which are on the left hand side. There are over 60 drawing tools in FX Draw, so many that we can't show you a button for every single one of them. What we've done instead is collect the buttons together into groups. So we have a group of lines, for example. If I click on the line button, the little arrow next to the line button, we'll see that there are 6 line types. There's 2 line-like tools, a ruler and a dimension line. There's also the access to some standard default lines, things like networks and directed networks. Every button over here, or just about every button, has a little arrow next to it that gives us similar tools. So the rectangle button has a selection of quadrilaterals. The triangle button has a selection of triangles and other polygons. The ellipse button has ellipses and other conic curves. Probably the most interesting button is the second last one. This one, which has dropped off the bottom of the recording, so I'll put it in the middle for you. This one gives you access to all of the really specific mathematical tools that do things that pretty much no other tool can do. That's really worth exploring, and there's some very interesting tools underneath that one. So take a look around the buttons on the side, see what you can find. There's some really interesting stuff. Let's take a look at how you can select figures to make changes to them. First, we'll draw ourselves a diagram. We'll draw a circle. We'll add a tangent line. Notice it's telling me it's a tangent. And then we'll add a radius from the center to the tangent point. If I want to change something about one of these items or one of these figures, I need to select it in some way. So I can either do that by changing to the select tool at the top by clicking on it, or alternatively I can double click somewhere on the canvas and it changes to select automatically. Once I've done that, I can click on one figure to make a change to that one figure. So I might, for example, wish to change that line to be a dotted line. So select, change. Let's change the tangent so it's a thicker line. I can select individual figures by clicking on them. I can also select groups of figures by sweeping out a rectangle, and anything inside the rectangle will be selected. So I've selected all 3 figures. If I restrict my rectangle, I might end up selecting 2. I can also hold down the control key or command key whilst I'm clicking, and that will add figures and take figures off my selection as I click. So selecting figures is required to actually change the properties of the figures, and there are multiple ways of doing it. One final little tip: you can always select all the figures on the page by either doing Control A or Command A on a Mac, or alternatively you can go to the Edit menu and choose Select All. In this lesson we're going to look at how to edit the properties of any of the figures that you've drawn on your canvas. We can edit the properties of the figure by right clicking on the figure, or on a Mac, Command click. That will call up any properties that are applied to that particular figure. So with our line, there's a wide variety of properties we can add. We can, for example, add an end arrow to our line and say OK, and an arrowhead's been added. Different figures have different properties. So if I click on the rectangle, right click and edit the properties of the rectangle, we get totally different properties, including things like the ability to add a grid to the rectangle with a set number of rows and columns. If right clicking or control clicking is difficult, which it can be particularly on tablet computers, there is the other option of clicking on this extra button that's been added when I've selected a figure, which will give me access to the same property screen. Editing figure properties is an important part of utilizing FX Draw to its full capabilities. In this lesson we're going to take a look at GAD, or Geometrically Aware Drawing, which is FX Draw's way of making drawing anything geometric as easy as possible. Before we get going, First, let's make sure we've got GAD turned on. It normally will be, but we'll just check. So it's this button here, so it's already on. We can start using GAD by drawing something like a line. And as I go and move around near the line, it will find things that are important on the line. Like at the moment, it's found the midpoint of the line, it's marked it with a little red dot, and it tells me that it's a midpoint down in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. If I start drawing now, that line, our new line, starts on the midpoint. And as we move around, get to here, FXDraw's analysed the geometry of what you're drawing and decided that you might be interested in this line, which is a perpendicular. So I'm effectively constructed the perpendicular bisector of my original line. It also does things like draws parallel lines. So if I've got one line there, as I'm moving, it's detected there, it's parallel, and again it's marking it nice and clearly for me, so I know that now I've created two parallel lines. The GAD system is on most of the time when you're drawing with FXDraw, and it makes things really simple. So for example, I can draw a line that comes from exactly on the circle and is tangential to the circle. Or if I have two circles, it will find things like common tangents, including the internal ones. So the GAD system is there to make drawing anything geometric as easy as possible. You don't have to do anything, just notice what it's showing you. In this lesson we're looking at how to move, resize and rotate figures on your screen. If you want to move a figure, click on it once to select it, and then you need to click on the line of the figure somewhere that's not inside the figure, and then just move around and the figure will be translated. Notice that the line's doing something interesting. We'll look at what that's doing later on. If you want to resize a figure, you need to click on one of the little yellow, red, or in this case green squares that are the control points of the figure. So if I click on this and move, it's going to resize the figure to suit the new position of the control point. To show you how to rotate a figure, let's draw a different figure. Let's draw a square. If I select the square, you'll notice this rotate button appears. Not all figures are rotatable, so that button will not always appear. Because it's there, if I grab it and move it, I will rotate my square. Often, when you're rotating, you don't want to rotate, you don't want to allow free rotation, so you might want to hold down the Shift key. When you hold down the Shift key, the square is going to rotate in 15-degree increments, which can be useful. You can also rotate multiple figures at the same time. If I sweep out a rectangle and select both of these figures, you'll notice that there is a rotate button. If I grab that button and rotate, both figures are rotated at the same time. You might have already noticed that when you select figures, the control points, or little squares, can appear to be green, yellow, or red, and may have wondered what's going on. Well, the simple answer, and in summary, green means the control point is free to move, yellow means it's locked to a relationship, and red means it's locked to a point. So to give you an example, if I click on the circle, the two control points are green, they're free to move. I can pick them up, move them, change the circle. If I click on the tangent line, you'll notice one end's green, so that's free to move wherever I like. The other end's yellow, which means that it's locked onto the relationship. In this case, the relationship is that it's on the tangent. So it's quite happy to move along there. It's a bit harder to drag off that relationship. Finally, if I click on the radius, you'll notice that both ends are red because they're locked to a point. This end is locked to the intersection of the circle and the tangent, or the tangent point, and the other end's locked to the center of the circle. So you're probably asking yourself, where do these relationships come from? Well, the simple answer to that is that you build them as you draw the diagram. So if I redraw the same diagram, there's my circle, and I could draw the circle wherever I liked. Now I draw the line, and by stopping there, I am marking the second point as being on the tangent. And finally, the second line starts on the tangent point, ends on the center of the circle. So I'm informing FXDraw of the geometric relationships that I'm trying to build as I'm drawing the diagram. FXDraw embeds these geometric relationships so that you can build up a geometric model that can be used to demonstrate things. So for example, if I mark the angle between the tangent and the radius as a right angle and start moving the tangent around, it automatically shows me that it's always a right angle. So these GAD links let you build a geometric model as you're drawing. The colours are telling you or giving you some information about what you've done. Let's have a look at how you can mark some angles in one of your diagrams. First step is to choose the Angle Mark tool, which is down here. Select the tool, and as you move around your diagram, FXDraw will automatically detect angles that it's near. Once I'm happy with an angle, I want to mark that one, left click my mouse and I get an angle mark. If I move to a different spot, left click, I get my angle mark. I can do lots to the angle. You'll notice already that it's been marked and measured. That measurement's dynamic. I can also click on the angle mark and change the spacing of the mark to get something that's more aesthetically pleasing. I can also select the angle mark, click on the properties button, and my angle has lots of properties I can set. So I can, for example, mark it as a pretend right angle, so that's useful for three-dimensional diagrams, so it looks like a right angle even when it isn't. I can mark it with all variations of measurements, or I can put in my own text, so I can mark it with X degrees, for example. And all of those marks are interactive and dynamic. There is another angle tool that is available to us that we'll look at in a later lesson. Let's take a look at the Marked Point tool. The Marked Point tool can do two jobs, so let's select it over here. The first job is if I click and release the mouse without moving, it will mark a point in the location where I currently am. More usefully, if I click and move, it will mark the point and add an annotation which it automatically increments. So I've got points A, B, C, and I'll mark that D. The auto increment is fairly intelligent, so if I go here, and it's going to mark it as E, but if I select that new point and edit it, I can change it to be something like A prime. And now, if I go back to marking points, it will start with that new sequence, mark A, B prime and C prime. I can also use Greek letters, so if I mark something which is coming through as D prime, I can change that to AL, which is the f of x code for alpha, change it to be an equation and say OK, so I've marked that point as alpha, and any further ones I mark, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, and so on. So the Mark Point tool gives you access to automatically incremented annotated points. FXDraw's Auto Point feature allows you to quickly add points, annotated points, to a geometric diagram as you're drawing it. To turn it on, you depress the Auto Points button and start drawing. So let's start drawing a line. As I draw my first line, it automatically adds a point to each end. If I draw a line off A, it will keep the A and add a C. And every time I draw a line which has endpoints or intersects with a previous line, or if I'm drawing a circle which intersects with things, every point will automatically be annotated with its own unique letter. It allows you to very quickly create a diagram with all points marked. It is a good idea to turn off auto points as soon as you finish drawing your diagram to make sure you don't add any extra points that you weren't anticipating. If you select a figure in FXDraw and then hover your mouse over the figure, FX Draw will show you some figure information that's specific to that figure. So here I've selected the triangle and it's showing me side lengths and angles and areas. I select the regular polygon, it shows me perimeters and areas and angle sum. Similarly for the ellipse and a normal distribution curve, it's showing me the shaded probability. This information can allow you to quickly analyze a shape, and the information is dynamic, so if I change the probability for my normal distribution curve, the figure information changes at the same time. What I can also do is, if I right click whilst that figure information is shown, I can choose to add an annotation. That annotation becomes a figure in its own right, so I can move it around, and it remains dynamic. So as I'm moving my triangle, the information that's associated with that particular figure is updated automatically. This allows you to build a dynamic environment where you can demonstrate things to students. Now that we've created an annotation, let's look at how we can edit it to make it say exactly what we're after. If I right click on the annotation, I'll get the annotation edit box appear at the bottom of the screen. You'll notice that the annotation in the edit box doesn't look anything like the annotation that's displayed. That is because the annotation has parameters that FX Draw replaces with the appropriate values. So I can, for example, remove this midpoint line, or I can add a unit of length by doing $U, which will add this time centimeters to my length. I can type whatever I like in the annotation. And FX Draw will replace the parameters with the appropriate values. You might say, how do you know what the parameters are? Well, if I push the parameters button, all the available parameters for that particular figure appear, and any of those can be used inside my annotation. So if you create a different figure, like for example an ellipse, and add an annotation, if I then go and right click on that annotation, you'll notice that there's already a lot of parameters, including things such as eccentricity, but if I look at the parameters, there's a full list of what's available. Most FX Draw figures have some sort of default setting. So for example, if I draw a circle, by default it puts a center mark on the center of the circle. I can change the default settings for any shape, any figure, by editing the properties of the figure, making the change, so let's make it a cross, and set that as the default. Once I've done that, it changes the one I've just drawn, but it also changes any future circles that I draw. Lots of figures have their own default settings. So for example, if I'm talking about an ellipse, which is one of the conics, I can change it so that it, by default, shows the axes. And any ellipse that I draw from that point on is going to show the axes until I change the default back to something else. All of the objects that have defaults operate in the same way. Create an object, edit it, make a change to the default that you're interested in. So let's say mark points I want to change so that they're 16 point to Homer, set as default, and now any future ones will be that new default. There is one tool that's different, that is the line tool. We'll have a look at how the line tool handles defaults in the next lesson. If the line tool was like any other tool in FX Draw, I could select a line I've drawn, edit the properties, and change something like middle arrow and set as default. When I did that, for any other tool, any further line I drew would have the middle arrow set, but with the line tool it's different. With the line tool, it's ignoring the defaults. So what's going on? With the line tool, to use the defaults, you have to perform an extra step. We actually have to say use defaults, or we can push the D key. Once I've done that, any lines I draw from that point on will have the middle arrow set. So why the difference? Well, the difference is with the line tool, you sometimes want to use a default, like having a middle arrow,
but often you just want a line. So if you are always setting and resetting defaults so you could just draw a standard line, it would be very difficult. But with the line tools, you can draw standard lines, you push the D key or choose defaults from the menu, and once you've done that, any line you draw from then on will use the current defaults. One specific use of default lines is to draw network diagrams quickly and easily. To do that, let's first set up the default line to represent a network. So I go down to choose a standard default line type, and there's a whole heap of pre-organized line types for you. We're going to choose directed network line. And notice that that process also turned on the line defaults. So now let's start drawing. So I select the line tool, and I get an open white circle at each end, and because I chose a directed network, I get an arrowhead in the middle of the line, and I can simply draw my network. If I wanted to add a value to each arc, I select an arc of the network, modify the properties, and I might start saying that this is 15, for example, and that will add a number to the arc. So using default lines, you can quickly draw networks. There are a number of other options. So we can draw networks and directed networks, or we can choose to draw vectors. So I can select a different default line and draw vector diagrams very quickly. So the default line types can be used to draw network diagrams and a number of other diagrams quickly and easily. FXDraw has three types of text boxes available: an auto text equation box, a plain text box, and an equation box. Most of the time you will just use the top one, so the auto text equation box. To use it, select the tool, click somewhere on the canvas, and a text entry screen pops up down the bottom, and you just type. And you can type something like, the equation is y equals x squared on 2 plus 3. And notice that as I'm typing, FXDraw is automatically identifying which bits are equation and which bits are normal text and formatting them appropriately. Totally automatic. This automatic process is controlled by this auto box. If the auto box is ticked, it's automatically identifying things using a technology we call FX Autoquate. Entering equations is discussed in the next lesson, and the equation technology is very competent. One thing that is useful though is to know how to type a degree sign in FXDraw, and in fact all FX products. And to type a degree sign, we use a little back dash that's on this spot on your keyboard. All through all FX products, that key is interpreted as a degree sign. FXDraw includes the FX equation engine, which allows you to type mathematics literally. So you can type something as simple as x squared take 4 all over 2x plus 1. I've typed it, FX equation / draw has turned it into an equation. We can also type things like sine squared theta plus cos squared theta equals 1, or integral from -1 to 1 of x squared dx. Because it's all based on typing, it's high speed, but if you can't quite remember how to enter a particular command, you can always use one of the examples where, if for example I want to do a combination, I go in here and say I want 5, choose 2, say OK, and it will automatically create the right text to achieve what you're after. We strongly recommend that you look at the FX equation lesson set to see the full power of the equation engine, but for the moment just know that it's highly competent and extremely fast. FXDraw contains a whole heap of very specialised tools that allow you to draw some things much easier than you otherwise would be able to. One such tool is the 3-point circle tool, and we've found that users sometimes find it a little bit tricky because it does something they don't expect. To give an example, I've selected the 3-point circle and I want to draw the circumcircle to this triangle. So the trick is to remember the 3 words: click, click, click. You click 3 times, one on each of the 3 points you want to define the circle by. I click and I move, and as I move, FX Draw is drawing a circle that isn't the circle I want. The reason it's doing that is at the moment I've only defined 2 points, my original click and what I'm currently near. So in order to draw the circle, it's inventing a 3rd point. If I click a second time, I've now marked 2 points, and as I move, I'm effectively defining 3 points, which allows it to draw a circle. So if I move close to the 3rd vertex and click a 3rd time, I've now defined the circle I was interested in. So to reiterate, to draw a 3-point circle, and there are a lot of 3-point tools, it's a 3-step process. Click, click, click. There are a few ways of drawing arcs in FX Draw. The 3-point arc, defined by 2 endpoints and a point on the arc, is a standard, easy to use figure type. Arcs defined by centers and endpoints are a bit harder to use. The first click is the center, and then I move out and you'll notice that there is a circle being produced, which is the circle that the arc is going to sit on. And when I click the second time, I start the arc and I move around to the end of the arc, and I get the arc I'm after. If I actually select that arc, you'll notice that there are 4 points defined: the center that I started with, my start point, and an end point. They're the 3 I defined, but there's an extra point up here which doesn't seem to be doing anything. The problem with an arc defined by a center and endpoints is that center and endpoints actually defines 2 arcs, this one and this one. That 4th point is really determining which of the 2 arcs, either the minor arc or the major arc, that my center and 2 endpoints are defining. There's another interesting aspect of arcs. If I edit the arc properties, you'll notice down the bottom there's the ability to turn my arc into a sector or a segment. So I'll change this one into a segment, and as soon as it's a segment, obviously it's drawn the segment, but it allows me to shade my segment. Let's look at FX Draw's compass-like tools. FX Draw has 2 compass tools. The first one is a compass circle. The compass circle operates just like a normal circle, except any subsequent circle will use exactly the same radius as the first circle you drew. Just like a compass, you set it to a radius and keep drawing circles. So that allows you to, for example, draw the old primary school daisy. The compass arc tool operates in much the same way. I mark the center, I move out to a radius and mark the 2 endpoints, and I end up with my arc, and any subsequent arc is drawn with the same radius. The compass arc tool is most useful when you're doing something like bisecting an angle. So I set my compass at the vertex and basically do a geometric construction. Which allows me to bisect the angle. If you find that the compass is set to a size that you no longer want, so you want to change the radius of the compass, all you need to do is to edit any of the compass arcs. Once you've done that, you start setting a new radius. When the GAD system is turned on, everything you do will be linked to something geometric. Usually that's exactly what you want. Sometimes the GAD system can get in the way. If you want to turn off GAD, you can choose either this button, where everything you draw will be locked to a grid point regardless of what else is near. So I won't be able to lock onto that line, it's locking onto the grid point every time. Alternatively, you can turn off all assistance, so you don't use grid or geometrically aware drawing. Then whatever you draw will be locked to wherever you have started and stopped clicking. There is another way to go with GAD. If I'm drawing a GAD image and I draw 3 lines, there are 3 points of intersection that the GAD system is identifying, as well as things like parallels and perpendiculars. As I add extra lines, the number of intersections starts rising exponentially. So if I start adding too many lines or too many geometric shapes, the GAD system can end up being overwhelmed by the complexity of the image you're creating. Because of that, the GAD system starts turning itself off as the diagrams get more complicated, to prevent the computer being bogged down by unnecessary work. Sometimes you want the GAD system to keep on working even when it gets really hard. That's the point of the 4th button. The 4th button will keep GAD working, finding all those points of intersection and endpoints and parallels and perpendiculars, regardless of how complicated the diagram gets. The toolbar allows you to control your use of GAD, turning it off when it's not necessary and making it unlimited when it is. We learnt in the last lesson how GAD can be overridden using the GAD toolbar. That's useful, but sometimes it doesn't do what you want. For example, let's say I want to draw a line which starts on the circle, so I need to use GAD, but when I get down here I don't want it to jump onto the end of the line. I actually want it to jump to a point just off the line, and it's actually very hard to achieve because GAD keeps getting in the way. There are 2 ways of overriding GAD using the keyboard. Whilst I am drawing, if I hold down the Shift key, GAD will ignore the endpoints and all the geometric relationships and just lock onto the grid, which is what's happening now. Alternatively, if I hold down the Control key, both GAD and the grid are being ignored at the same time. So by using the Shift key, I can lock onto the grid. By using the Control key, I can go exactly where I want to go. Sometimes when you're using FX Draw, you will want to line something up perfectly, but the mouse can be a little bit difficult to use. Because of this, FX Draw allows you to nudge things with the keyboard. So the arrow keys allow me to nudge or move the currently selected object by a small amount, just by pushing the arrow keys. That can allow me to, for example, put the circle exactly on top of the rectangle. If I hold down the Control key whilst using the arrow keys, the nudge is a bit bigger. If I use the Shift key whilst holding down the Control keys, the nudge is tiny. So between the arrow keys, Shift and Control, you can line up things exactly. In this lesson we're going to look at how to fill regions or shade regions. Most people, when they start wanting to fill a region, immediately look to the paint pot tool, but it's in fact the worst way of filling a region. In this lesson we'll look at the best way. If you want to fill a region that is a closed shape in its own right, like a rectangle or a circle, if you select the shape, go up to the fill toolbar, which is comprised of a brush style, colour and opacity. We'll shade this rectangle a dark grey, a solid grey, and make that a blue. And we'll shade the circle, again solid colour, and we'll make that purple. The nice thing about a shape that can shade itself, and just about any closed shape can, is that it's very fast, it's reliable, and you have the option of changing the shading's opacity, so I can make it transparent effectively. So I can make the circle transparent, I can make the rectangle somewhat transparent. Now let's look at a similar shape shaded with the paint pot. So I now have 2 circles, one that has been shaded using the fill toolbar because it can shade itself, the other one I'm going to shade with the paint pot. One thing that's different with
paint pot shading is I can't change the opacity, so that circle is going to remain a solid colour regardless of what I do. The other issue with paint pot shading, apart from the fact that it's slow, and we'll discuss why it's slow in a later lesson, is that the edge of the shading will never be as good. So if I zoom in on the edge between the circle and the shading, you may see slight gaps. Those gaps will not exist in the shape that can shade itself. In this, our second lesson looking at filling regions, we're going to take a look at the Paint Pot tool, also known as Flood Fill. The Paint Pot tool is different in FX Draw compared to most products because it's dynamic. So I've clicked in a region and that region is bounded by the circle and the rectangle, but if I move something, the filled region is recalculated, and that is significantly different from most drawing tools, which flood fill once and then leave it forever. That does mean that FX Draw has to tell you where you've clicked. That's what this little X is for. It's showing you where on the diagram you have clicked for flood fill. If you want to change the flood fill, you need to select that little X so you can change, for example, color. The little X only appears inside FX Draw. When I export the image, the little X won't be there. It's solely to tell you where you've clicked. It does mean though that there can be some confusion with the flood fill tool when you start moving things around. The flood fill is calculated based on where you've clicked. So for example, if I move the rectangle, all of a sudden I've now clicked outside of that rectangle and I'm shading a different region. Sometimes when people are using the tool, we will hear a comment like, my shading fell out of my rectangle, and that's what's happening. The click has moved locations compared to the shapes around it. The only other issue with the flood fill tool is that if I click outside of all objects, nothing will be shaded because there are no bounds. So in summary, the Paint Pot tool or flood fill tool shades based on where you've clicked. It shades out to boundaries that have been pre-drawn, and it's dynamically calculated. So every time you change anything, the flood fill is recalculated. In this final lesson about filling regions, there's two bits. The first bit is this screen has 7 objects, all of which have some fill. Interestingly, not one of them uses a paint pot or flood fill. So everything, like the 2-circle Venn diagram, to change the shading for that, I just say I want that sector shaded, and FX Draw does the work. Using flood fill is almost always not necessary. The second thing about flood fill is that it relies on order. So if I draw a circle and a line and then flood fill, or one section of the circle, if I draw another line, because flood fill is dynamic, you would expect that it will shade to this new line, but flood fill also respects the drawing order. So we drew the circle first and the first line, then we flood filled, and it flood fills at that point, not when we've drawn that second line. If I really want to flood fill just the area where the X currently is, what I need to do is change the drawing order and put the line at the back. As soon as I put the line at the back, flood fill recalculates and just fills the bit bounded by the line. Often when you're drawing FX Draw diagrams, you'll end up with a complicated diagram consisting of lots of individual figures that you really want to operate as a group. And doing that in FX Draw is easy. You select all the objects that you require in your group, and you've got 3 options. You can either use the group button up here, or you can go group from the edit menu, or we can do Control G. Once we've done that, the objects are collected as one rectangular group, and whatever I do to the whole group at once. So I can move them, I can rotate them, I can change the size, or I can even distort them, and whatever I do is operating to the whole group at once. I can also ungroup a collection of figures
by using the Ungroup button if what I've selected is a group, or Edit Ungroup or Control H. We'll use the button. That breaks the group back down into individual pieces, so I can edit each individual part by itself. So I could, for example, remove the circle. FX Draw comes supplied with dozens of pre-drawn images that you can use in your diagrams quickly and easily. All you need to do is go to the gallery button and choose which gallery you're interested in. We'll use this Chance Processors gallery. We select the object we're particularly interested in and sweep out an image, and wherever I go, that image is drawn out for me. Gallery images are not just static bitmaps. There's a few important things that you need to know about them. The first one is that the direction you draw the gallery image matters. So if I draw it that way, I'll get the image that way. If I start at the top right and go to the bottom left, the image is reversed. If I start down the bottom of my rectangle and go up to the top right, we get a worm's eye view, and similarly if I go the other way. So the direction of my gallery image matters, and so does the aspect ratio. So if I stretch it out, I'll get a very wide flat die that isn't going to be particularly useful. The other thing that's useful about gallery images is that we can change them. At the moment, if I click on it, it comes up as one rectangular figure. But you'll notice that there is the ungroup option available that we discussed in a previous lesson. If I click on that, it breaks down my image into its component parts, which I can individually select and, for example, change the color of something or delete something else. So gallery images can be broken down. You can add to them, subtract from them, and create exactly what you're after, but starting out with the basis that we've provided for you. The galleries are comprehensive. Probably the most complicated images that are stored in the gallery are the Menger's cubes, where if we get rid of those and sweep out a Menger's cube, so the Menger's cube is probably the most complicated gallery item available. Because FX Draw is a mathematician's tool, it doesn't just have one way of drawing lines, it has 6. So the standard line type that we've played with previously is a line defined by its 2 endpoints, but we can also define a line by a midpoint and an endpoint. Or the bottom two are also interesting. There's a rise run line where I draw a line defined by its endpoints, but as soon as I let go of the mouse, it tells me the X and Y offsets of that line, and if I change that to say 7 and 2, it will redraw the line to suit those offsets. And the fourth fairly standard one is a length angle line, so I draw a line, up pops a dialog box where I can change the length to say 7 and the angle to exactly 40 degrees compared to horizontal, and it will realign the line to suit those. The other two line types are slightly more interesting. There is the ray and the extended line. We'll look at the extended line first. When I start drawing an extended line, it looks much the same as a standard line. But the difference is, when I release my mouse, I haven't yet finished, because one further click will define where the line starts, and the fourth click will define where it stops. And those 2 points, the starting and stopping point, don't even need to be anywhere near the 2 original points. The 2 original points define the orientation of the line. The third and fourth point define where the line starts and stops. In other words, the extended line breaks the nexus between where the line starts and stops and how I've orientated the line. That can be useful in some demonstrations or some constructions. To give an example of a use of this concept in a construction, we're actually going to use the last line type, which is a ray. If I select the ray, and I'll scroll down to a diagram I've drawn earlier, if I was demonstrating constructions and this construction is finding the bisector of an angle, I want to draw a line that starts at the vertex and goes through that intersection but doesn't want to stop at it. So my ray tool My first 2 points define the orientation of the line, but I don't want it to just stop at the intersection. I want it to go through, which is what a student's likely to do when they're drawing this diagram. And my third click defines the endpoint of the line. The multiple line types available in FXDraw make it far more useful from a mathematics teacher's point of view. This lesson is all about how to draw squares. We'll select the rectangle tool. If I start drawing the rectangle will sit where the cursor currently is. If, on the other hand, I hold down the Shift key whilst moving my mouse around, it will force the rectangle to be square, and will do the biggest square it can based on the mouse position. That's more useful than it might first seem. For example, often if I'm drawing a function graph, I will actually want a square set of axes, and by holding down the Shift key I can draw a square set. Similarly for stats graphs and Venn diagrams, so for example 3-circle Venn diagram, I can force it to be square, and for the sets to be circular. So holding down the Shift key forces whatever you're drawing to be square. There is another little wrinkle to that we'll discuss in a later lesson. In this lesson we're going to look at how to include bitmaps or pictures into your FXDraw diagrams. There's 2 ways of achieving this. The first way is to find an image you're interested in, like this one, copy the image to our clipboard, change back to FXDraw and simply paste it, and the image will pop straight into your FXDraw diagram. You then have the option of overlaying it with something, so we can add a line or circles or whatever shape we like to that image. The second way of inserting an image into an FXDraw diagram is to choose the bitmap tool, which is down here underneath rectangles as import picture. We sweep out a rectangle that we want to fill with an image, and we have the option then of opening a file, so we'll scroll down to an interesting image, the Nautilus shell, and then it appears in my FXDraw canvas and I can overlay something with that. Obviously the Nautilus shell, you could overlay a spiral generated by the graphing tool to show students that mathematics can be used to describe nature. FXDraw contains 2 tools that allow you to draw smooth curves. The first tool is the Smooth Line tool. It allows you to draw a freehand curve that FXDraw will smooth as best it can. You can edit the curve by moving around control points, which will modify the curve. The Smooth Line tool is useful, but doesn't always produce exactly what you're after, and can sometimes produce a curve that appears a bit lumpy. The second curve type is a Bezier curve. Bezier curves, also known as cubic splines, allow you to draw quite complicated curves in bits. They are controlled by 4 control points. The first 2 define the start and finish of the curve. So as I'm drawing it, I end up producing a line. The third point controls the angle of the tangent of the start of the curve, and the fourth point controls the angle of the tangent of the end of the curve. More importantly, the length of the tangent controls how tightly the curve finishes and starts. So by controlling the 2 tangents and the start and the end point, I can produce a smooth curve. By combining Bezier curves, I can produce pretty much any curve I want. One other feature of both Bezier curves and smooth lines is if I edit the properties, I can make the lines double or even triple, which allows you to draw some interesting combinations of shapes. FXDraw has a number of tools that draw polygons, ranging from triangles and specialized triangle tools, as well as quadrilateral tools, but we're going to look at the tool that's designed to draw any polygon. The Polygon tool is easy to use. Every time you click, you add a vertex, and it will keep doing that indefinitely. If you wish to end drawing your polygon, the easiest way to do that is to right-click. That will close the polygon and make it permanent. I can then move the vertices around
I can also right click on any side or any edge, edit the properties and add a mark. I can also, if I right click on the edge of a polygon, edit the properties and add a vertex. And if I right click on a vertex, I can edit the properties and delete that vertex. Probably the most important use of a polygon is to shade. I can change the color and the opacity. We've already looked at how to use the line and shading toolbars. They allow you to control the line type of any line that's currently selected or anything that's based on lines. So I can change line style, thickness and color. It will also allow me to change the shading of a closed object. So I can shade my circle green. But what we haven't discussed yet is how to change the default line. So at the moment my default line is black, 1 point, solid. If I want to change the default line type, what I have to do is to change the line type when nothing is currently selected. So at the moment nothing on my screen is selected. If I change the line type now, so I'm going to make it a 3-point line and I'm going to make it a dark blue. From now on, anything that is based on lines will be drawn in a 3-point dark blue line by default. If I wish to change the line type to a new line type, change back to select, make sure there's nothing selected, change the line type now, and we'll go back to black, and this time 2-point, and then any line is going to come out as black 2-point. So the important thing about changing default line types and default shadings is to do it when nothing is currently selected. There's a little trick you can use to make using GAD a little bit simpler. Sometimes, if you've got a diagram like this one, and you want to draw something that starts at the intersection, sometimes getting to the intersection can be a little bit tricky because there's so many points of interest, interesting points as far as GAD is concerned, around the same place. So here I've got a midpoint, I've got a third point on a line, I've got the point of intersection I'm after, I've got points on the line. There's so many things happening that actually making GAD pick the right one can be tricky. One thing you can do is to not get too close. Every geometric point of interest is allocated an attractiveness, and points of intersection are considered very attractive. So if I'm quite a long way away from the point of intersection, GAD will find it and mark it as it's done there. Sometimes if I'm closer to the line, it's going to say, well, that point on the line is more important than the intersection because you're so close to it. To find that really important point, you actually need to move slightly away from it rather than getting too close. FX Draw remembers the order that you drew things in. So in my example here, I drew 4 rectangles, green, blue, red and yellow in that order. So when FX Draw renders those 4 rectangles, it renders them in that order as well, and the yellow one covers up all the others. If I add another object like a circle and shade that, that covers up all the underlying objects. Sometimes you'll want to change the drawing order, and that's where the drawing order toolbar comes along. So my circle, which I've currently selected, I might want to move it back 1 in the drawing order, which is what this last button does. So it's now under the yellow, but on top of the other 3, and I can move it back through the drawing order or forward through the drawing order. I can do the whole process at once and move it all the way to the back, or bring it all the way to the front. So by controlling the drawing order, you can produce diagrams that suit your need exactly. One of the powerful features of the FX Draw gallery objects is that you can use them in any aspect ratio and produce diagrams that look quite different. But sometimes you want to use an aspect ratio that makes sense. So let's show you an example of that. If I want to draw the lighthouse, if I draw the aspect ratio incorrectly, I get something that isn't quite lighthouse-ish. One of the features of FX Draw is the ability to force it to use the correct aspect ratio for a gallery image. To do that, we hold down the Shift key as we're drawing the image, and it forces us to use the same aspect ratio as the original creator of the gallery image. It's a bit like using the Shift key to force a rectangle to be square, but in this case we're using it to force the aspect ratio to be correct. FX Draw lets you draw isometric diagrams quickly and easily. The first thing you need to do is to push the isometric grid button. That does a few things. It changes to an isometric grid, it also makes the grid sizes a bit larger, it also turns off GAD, so you're just drawing with the grid, which is typically easier. You can have more control over the isometric grid by going to Tools, Grid, where you can set the size explicitly and decide whether it's isometric or not. Once we have an isometric grid, we'll select a line and start drawing, and FX Draw will lock you to the isometric grid as you draw, so drawing anything isometric is trivial. And here's one we prepared earlier. As you draw, FX Draw builds up a geometric model of what you're drawing. So here I've drawn two circles, then I've drawn this line which joins the points of intersection of the two circles. Because it's a geometric model, if I change the model by changing one of the circles, it recalculates where that line needs to be and redraws it appropriately. That's normally fantastic, but sometimes it's not what you want. There are two ways of preventing that from happening. The first way is to break the GAD links that we've created. So if I select the object that was linked to the two circles and push this button, I will remove or break the links. You'll notice that as soon as I do that, the two ends of the line turn green, which means it is no longer linked to a point, and if I move the circle, it stays where it was. The other option, which can be useful if you're producing something to demonstrate to students, is to actually lock all of the figures by pushing the lock button. So I've selected all three figures, I push the lock button, you'll notice that all the control points are now grey and I can't do anything with them. I can't move them at all. So they are locked in place, and the only way I can actually move them is to select all those figures again and unlock them by pushing that button again.